We are starting with the new technical notes as our first module. Appliance theory with myself, Simon, and first module is mu technical notes. Okay, so the BiBlock stage 1 is the primary appliance that is used in the postural orthodontic program. We have an upper appliance and a lower appliance. The appliance is created with a number of structures that help achieve the change that we want in the palate. We break the appliance down into the expansion mechanism, which is the central screw in a transverse application. We have an anchorage component, which are the clasps. We generally tend to crib the middle teeth. So because predominantly in postural orthodontics, we are working on mixed dentition patients, the primary tooth that we are anchoring onto are the second primary molars, right? The E's. We then have to understand that when we are anchoring an appliance, we have to have both retention and resistance forms. So retention form is designed to hold your appliance from falling out. Resistance form is there to prevent your appliance from rocking around that anchor point. And so if we think in terms of pitch, roll, and yaw, which are the planes that movement in aeroplanes, but also when we're talking about occlusal planes, we need to make sure that the appliance doesn't roll. Like when you're driving a car and you brake too hard and you come forward, or you accelerate hard and you go back. So we don't want that rocking action. And how we prevent that from happening is we have wires towards the front and wires towards the back that rest on the teeth. So in the case where we are in mixed dentition, we have the clasps on the primary E's, and then we will have a rest wire that sits on the occlusion of the 6. And we'll have a rest wire that sits on the primary canines. Now, on recent times, I've also added a little rest on the D's to stop that rocking action, that sometimes the C's don't provide the resistance form that we need. And not so much on the upper appliance, but always on the lower appliance now. The front wires on the incisors are what we call cat wires, catenary wires, and they're designed specifically to help create both resistance form and to orthodontically help you align the incisors. And they run 2 wires that come from both the left and the right side, and they cross in the middle, and they end approximately at the laterals. And we'll talk in more detail when we design it so that you can visualize it. When we have teeth that are excessively spaced, sometimes we'll have what we call an approximation wire, which will run on the distal of the incisors to help shift the incisors together and close excess diastomers. In circumstances where we have the need for reversible headgear, we'll also put a hook onto around the primary canine region so that we can attach extra oral elastics to reversible headgear. So that's generally the wire work that's involved. Clasps, usually in the middle teeth, a rest wire on the tooth behind the free end saddle, in front of the free end saddle. So in this case, the primary E is the clasping wire, and then the first permanent molar is the primary rest wire, and that stops the plate from rocking from front to back. We also have a rest wire that engages the primary canine, which acts both as a resistance form, but also to make sure that the primary canine is kept within the expansion process. We have wires at the front that sit behind the incisors, and that helps to A, also provide resistance form, and B, to be able to move the incisors into different positions and help align the teeth. The catenary wires at the front, think of them like lingual brace arch wire. If we have excessive spacing in the incisors, in some cases, as spacing malocclusions like division 1s, then sometimes you want to close the diastomer, and you can use a thinner wire to do that. Now, on the palate is the hardware to connect all the wires together, as well as the main expansion screw. So the screw sits basically midline around that clasping teeth plane, so around the E's. And there's acrylic that joins the palate to the screw to the clasps and the wires. When we are looking at asymmetric expansion in timing, because the screw mechanisms are different on the upper compared to the lower, and the expansion rates for the upper and lower are different, we know that the upper will always expand faster than the lower, because A, we have suture on the maxilla, and B, the screw is physically larger. We are effectively semi-rapid expansion on the upper and slow expansion on the lower. So because we have asymmetric expansion, we have to build a ramp adjacent to the palatal cusps of the primary molars to allow for the fact that for a short time, the child will be in a Brody bite or a scissors bite. All right, so that's basically the bones of the appliance. Now, we'll talk about screw specifications, and we'll talk about diameters of the wires in an upcoming module. If we look at the second slide, you'll see that John has highlighted very clearly in red arrows the anchorage retention clasp, where the force is to counteract the plate coming out of the mouth. So that's anchorage. And the resistance form, which is to stop the rocking. Okay, so the clasps themselves. We have, over the years, used different clasping mechanisms, but John uses a Crozat clasp, which we also follow at the moment. And so that clasp is effectively a clasping mechanism that runs around the tooth and has a soldered crescent wire which engages underneath the contact point. And so this will be clearer when I go through the next modules where we highlight the appliances themselves. But it's a two-piece wire mechanism. There's a connector wire that joins the plate, runs across the interproximal embrasure of the teeth, and then it sits on the buccal margin midway down. And then we solder a wire that sits underneath the contact points as your primary retention mechanism. The clasps historically was soldered crescent to the connector wire, but we'll go through how we've modified that ourselves over the years because solder tends to fail on a very consistent basis, and which is why, you know, part of today's program is about how to do some in-clinic soldering to do repairs. But you'll find that with our modification that well, I'm never bringing out the soldering kit anymore, not for 5-6 years now. But for most people who will use their own lab, guaranteed you will need a soldering kit because they're not following a very specific protocol that we've developed because they're not really aware of it. And Rico hasn't really been teaching this. Okay, so we know that the anchorage in removable appliances is critical because the reality is removable appliances suck. They don't work. The secret to a removable appliance working is when it's really hard to remove it. So almost maximum anchorage is what we're looking for. We want something that just doesn't fall out. But we also have to understand the principles that it can't rock in the mouth. And so anchorage and resistance form, retention and resistance form are critical as far as making a removable appliance operate like a fixed appliance, which we know fixed appliances work because they're there all the time. Now, the shelves against the molar teeth are really important because we don't want these appliances to be entirely tissue-borne. So now we've got to think in terms of this is a removable orthodontic appliance, but we've got to think in terms, this is actually a partial denture. All right, when we start to think in terms, this is a partial denture, then all of a sudden, everything I'm talking to you about will clarify in your mind as so easy to understand. Now, in the world of prosthetics, partial dentures are all acrylic with wire cribs, cobalt chrome with precision attachment, or fixed partial dentures, such as bridges, crown and bridges, implant support. Right? They're the three types. Now, which is the ones that seem to be most loved and most liked? Fixed. What's the second? Chrome with the precision attachment. What's the one that everyone hates? The flippers, right? The all acrylic. So why have we moved towards fixed appliances rather than removable appliances? Because the principle's the same whether it's a denture or an orthodontic appliance. Now, what is something that can be made to work really, really well in a semi-dentate mouth? A chrome cobalt. And so we have to think of good orthodontic removable appliances being more like chrome cobalts than all acrylic removable dentures. And so the same principles apply when you're designing a cobalt frame and you're designing the acrylic to go over it. So put on your prosthetic hat when you're designing these appliances, and you'll start to understand what it is that you need to create. Now, I know we are all supposed to design our own partial dentures. And I know most of us just write, make a partial denture, replace these teeth, and that's it. All right. We don't survey the models, we don't design the models. We need to start to think in terms of, if you want something really, really good, you've got to be the architect of it. I'm going to teach you how to be the architect of a really good removable orthodontic appliance. Now, tissue bearing appliance is all acrylic, which is why it primarily sucks, because it's tissue borne entirely. There's no real tooth bearing in an all acrylic appliance. Partial dentures that have a cobalt chrome component to it are much, much better because they're partially borne by the teeth. So these appliances that we design have to incorporate some of those components, and we use acrylic. So we wrap the acrylic around the waist of the palatal of the upper primary molars, and it lips onto right up against the palatal cusp, almost up to the tip on those D's and the E's on the acrylic, so that it takes the load off the soft tissues. The rest wires take the load off the soft tissue, so that you get some acrylic contact on the soft tissues, whether it be the palate or the dental alveolar on the lower, and you have wires and acrylic that sit on the teeth so that you have a little bit of bearing. So that's how we can get expansion without ulcers on the soft tissue, when we load some of that bearing onto the tooth structure, but we also have some contact on the soft tissues, which are in connection with the palate and the dental alveolar. One of the reasons why fixed appliances in ortho cannot achieve the same results is because they're all tooth bearing. And so all the load is transferred only to the dental alveolus. There literally is nothing transferred to the skeletal basal bone. And so the advantage, the primary advantage of a removable appliance that is very hard to dislodge and has teeth and soft tissue loading is that it incorporates the best of both worlds. It impacts not only the teeth position, but it impacts the skeletal, bony underlying foundation as well. So that's why we use removable appliances. We have different variations that John goes through. We have appliances that extend beyond the occlusal plane and can be used to correct crossing of the bite. So he talks about flanges that extend from the upper down to the lower. When we are using upper removable appliances for transverse correction, often we're dealing with a unilateral crossbite. And unilateral crossbite is actually really difficult to resolve symmetrically, because when you expand the upper arch that has a unilateral crossbite, the maxilla expands nicely, but you just get a bigger crossbite. Right? You get the good side getting worse and into a scissors bite, and the bad side staying into a crossbite. One of the simple ways that John has created, which I'll show in graphic detail in the upcoming modules, is that we can correct within a month or two a locked-in crossbite by forcing the crossbite side to expand, but not allowing the good side to turn into a scissors bite. Now, in John's lower appliance, he does not expand. Very few people understand the concept that it is possible to expand a lower arch. John doesn't expand the lower arch. We've all been taught you cannot expand the lower arch. And what we need to do is differentiate between the mandible and the lower arch. You cannot expand the mandible. You can expand the lower arch. Now, the lower arch is a mandible, but they're not the same thing. One is dental alveolar, one is basal. What we also forget is that when we have that rule, you can't expand the lower arch, you can't expand the mandible, we're talking about teenagers, right? Because all that teaching that we have about lower arch being the anchorage arch, the presenting arch being the arch that doesn't change, cannot be changed. We're saying once the permanent canines have erupted, then you have a fixed position of lower arch dimension. And to a major degree, that is true. But we're dealing with children who are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. When do the primary canines change over? 10 and 11. So if you have a 13-year-old, you're not looking at expanding anything on the lower. But when you have a 7-year-old and the permanent canine is 3 years away, guess what? You can expand the dental alveolar form, expand the lower arch. And while they're still growing, you can influence the basal bone because there's more dental alveolar in a 7-year-old than there is basal bone. But a 13-year-old, there's more basal bone than there is dental alveolar. That's just the nature of how we grow. So the appliances are the same on the lower, except there is no palate. So we still class the primary, the middle teeth, which is a primary second molar, is the preference. We have a rest on the 6-year-old molar. We have a rest on the primary canine, but I've added an additional rest on the first primary molar, the D, because then I've got a rest on the 6 and the D, and I'm classing the E, and there's a reduction in the amount of ulcers that can occur when you're trying to develop the lower. One of the big problems that I found personally is I would always get ulcers around the D and the C area in the lower when we try to expand. But since I've added the rest on the D, that's gone away. All right, he talks about retainers. And retainers can be anything you like. Right? We're used to Hawley retainers. I tend to design retainers that are pretty much the same as my expansion appliances, except there's no screw in the middle. So that's just a simple way of understanding. All right, so if we want to make a transverse change, then we put a screw in the middle. If we don't want to make the transverse change because we're just holding the arch because we finished our treatment, our active treatment, then you just design the same appliance but without the screw in the middle.
There's one right there.
So our goal is to consider at the end of your mixed dentition development, you are going to start to have teeth changeover. Teeth changeover occurs in 2 periods in our life, as far as permanent dentition is concerned. We have no permanent teeth until 6. And at 6, we get a 2-year period where we're changing teeth over from all primary to early mixed dentition. And then there's a stable point where nothing changes until about 10, where over the next 3 years, we lose the remainder of the primary dentition and the permanent dentition comes through. Now, the design of your appliance must take into consideration this fluidity, this dynamic state of transition, early transition, late transition. And so you've got to be mindful of when teeth start to exfoliate and change over, because your appliance has to have a life expectancy. If you design an appliance that cribs a primary second molar and they're 12, how long will that appliance last? 3 months? Yeah. So just because it feels solid doesn't mean that there's any life left in the tooth if you know the timing of the changeover, right? So late mixed dentition starts at around 10 for the majority of people. And the sequence of events is lower C's fall out, then upper D's, then lower D's, and then upper E's, and then lower D's, lower E's, and then upper C's. Right? So there's a sequence of timing, and it starts at 10 and it finishes at 13. And they're kind of 6 months apart-ish. So when you start to get these signs, you'll start to see the changeover occurring, and then you can, in your mind's eye, at least plan for that changeover. In a late mixed dentition, when all the primary molars is falling out, we stop clasping the middle teeth and we start clasping the end teeth. So we'll clasp 6, and we'll clasp the incisors that have stopped movement. Now, so long as you have a tooth distal, then you can clasp the middle and then put a rest behind it. So there are certain times where you might clasp a D and put a rest on an E in a full primary dentition case. And in a later aging child, when the 12-year-old molars is through, you might clasp a 6 and put the rest on the 7. Now, why don't we just clasp 6s and centrals, right? And then save the worry about things falling out and disrupting the appliance? And the answer is inherently, it's more stable to clasp in the middle and have rests front and back than it is to clasp on the ends. The appliances just are not as stable. They're much better retained and they have much better resistance form. And the reason is when you clasp a back tooth and a front teeth, you are both resistance form and retention form in the one component. Whereas when you clasp a middle tooth, you have separate anchorage and you have separate resistance form. Think of it like all-in-one shampoo and conditioner versus separate shampoo and conditioner. It always works better when they have each component as an individual role. All right, so that's basically the process. John talks about a stage 3 appliance, which is not something that we'll need to go through here. But when we have a mixed dentition changeover, we tend to find that sometimes we have teeth that don't erupt well. We have developed a nice arch form because we stepped in and we put the screws in and we turned. And we got the incisors into a nice relationship. And then you think, all right, my job is done. I'm happy days. And then the teeth change over and the new premolars and canines come out in the old position of before you expanded. And you'll find that routinely, lower canines will come through lingually, lower 7s will come through lingually, premolars will come through in the lower arch, usually pretty good, but in the upper, they'll come through palatally. And if you are mindful that that can happen a lot, then you can design wires in your retainers, finger springs and wires that anticipate that there will be teeth coming through in the wrong position. And you put them in and you wait. And when they come through in the wrong position, you can use that spring to move them more buccally or more buccally is generally the need. Right? Generally, more buckling is what we want. We have very specific attachments that we can apply. One of the attachments is a reversible headgear on the top. Another attachment is what we call a Hoffman wire. A lot of kids have active mentalis strain. And basically that is a function of them sucking on their lip when they swallow. And you can add in, if you like, a boundary wire that sits on the sulcus roughly in line with the gingival margin. And it acts like a fence wire that is uncomfortable to suck against. And so sometimes we add modifications to that. There are other appliances that John uses, which we don't need to go through into too much detail. Okay, but that's the principle behind how each component has a role. And then now I'm going to illustrate to you guys what it means, this theory into its application. All right, so that is the end of the MU Technical Notes module.
With the stage one, which I use quite a lot, in the lower, there's a little hook in there. I actually end the little thing just to expand it. Sometimes you only need a millimetre or two after you already expand it out. So you just press it below and just push it out.
Yep, perfect.
As well as the other wires.
We use the appliances as they're designed, but we can modify the designs of the appliance to suit our needs. If we understand how very light, gentle, but consistent pressure influences the growth and development and the positioning of the teeth, then you can play with it.
Next question, right? It happens quite a bit. You've got a class 2 Gen 1, you've got you expand the maxilla, you've got to expand the lower. Now they're out of sync with each other. So do you have any guidance to just how you measure the lower to go out to a certain degree of expansion? With
Okay.
With the upper guy, with
yes.
I use
yep.
42, no later than 44.
Yep. So I'll give you the rule of thumb. Obviously, you have to be very specific in individual cases, but I'll give you the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb is based on the work by Banker in 2018, I think. And she measured the dimensions of a normal arch form of a class 1 orthognathic patient, right? So no malocclusion. And they found that the majority of people had an intermolar width. Right? So we're measuring from the gingival margin of the upper 6 Carabelli cusp area to the gingival margin of the other 6. Around 38 millimeters is the normal distance of the upper molars with no malocclusion and a normal class 1. Now, I found that that almost always corresponds with the flat curve of Wilson in the lower arch. So I will usually expand to about 38, 37, 39, depending on how big the teeth are on the upper, and then I'll stop. And that is almost always enough to get the front teeth to fit. So we have to remember, transverse expansion is primarily to make room for the front teeth. So generally, you need to expand until you've got enough room for the front teeth, and that is generally 38 millimeters intermolar width.
Yeah, Mew talks about
He'll go to 43.
44
Yeah, he'll go to 43.
That, yeah.
Okay, but that is the goal of getting 32 adult teeth into plate.
Yeah.
All right, that's getting the wisdom teeth into plate. Now,
if you're dealing with a 7-year-old, if you go more than 38, 39 millimeters, you'll get into a Brody bite. Right? You'll get into a Brody bite where you have a scissors bite, right? The upper is way bigger than the lower. And the only way to resolve that is with John's technique of a stage 3 appliance and to enormously grow the lower arch into forward rotation. We're not focusing on that style of treatment because the reality is, unless you use a stage 3 appliance, you'll never achieve a good match if you get to 43 millimeters on the intermolar width.
Another interesting thing is you can't find a impression tray big enough.
Yes, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Now, what corresponds nicely with an upper width of 38, 39, 37 is a flat curve of Wilson on the lower. So basically what you're doing is you're just uprighting the molars until it's flat. Literally it's leveling and aligning the lower arch.
You're talking about the
Curve of Wilson.
the walls, whatever
Yeah, Spey is that way.
that way, that's right.
Yeah, Wilson is that way.
Maybe just-
So when your molars are basically upright,
You've gone from there to there.
yes.
That's right.
When that's upright, that almost universally corresponds with an upper, which is about 38. So that's how I judge it. I eyeball it and think, is that flat or has it still got the curve?
You don't have a specific measurement, say, for the upper cusp of the lower sixes, or anything, say, the roundabout.
Generally, it works really nicely. When it's uprighted,
Yep.
it marries up to 38 on the top. And so that, and then you play with it, right? If you got an Oriental Asian and they got huge incisors, 39, 40, but you'll find they have big teeth everywhere. And then your lower arch, you upright it and it works. It works. So that's a really good rule of thumb for early intervention orthodontics, postural orthodontics, not entirely applicable for orthotropics, but that's a different ballgame. Right? Because his goal, John's goal is, I want 32 adult teeth in the play. Right? Now, a caveat to John's 44. I'll go to 43, 42, 43 in orthotropics. When I finish and I have this 8s erupting, when I measure the 6s, it's back down to 38. And I'm thinking, what happened? What happened? Why? I didn't lose anything. Why? And the answer is, when I moved the molars forward to take up all the excess space, I moved into a smaller dimension. The 7s are sitting at 40-ish, but the 6s aren't. What's the widest tooth in your arch? The 7s. John's moving the 6s into the 7 position, then he's moving the 6s forward into the 5 position and then the 7s into the 6 position because he's tracking everything forward. So at the end of it, the 7s are in that 40s, but the 6s are back down to 38, 39. And so that's just the reality. The 6s are always around 38, 39. The 7s go to 43, 42. But when we start orthotropics, we're getting the 6s into the 7 position, then we're moving them forward, which is, again, a different ball game to what I'm trying to teach you.
It's always heresy for me to say this, but I do a lot of 7 extractions to allow the 8s to come in.
Look,
And
sometimes
it works really well, and they're very stable.
Yep.
Or especially in orthodontic cases, you don't take premolars.
you've just got to find
I
some.
also take wisdom teeth out.
Yep.
And which one would you prefer, and which one gives you a better result?
Yeah, when you are dealing with a compromise, right? When you're not aiming for 32 adult teeth, you're dealing with a compromise, then you just work out the best compromise. Okay, so
Sorry,
yes.
Simon, you mentioned about the unilateral crossbite.
Yes.
So I thought most of the time it is bilateral.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Right? So most cross bites are not bilateral. Well, when do you actually see that?
Yeah. I think because of the functional shift, because it's too small. And then,
No, most cross bites are unilateral, right? Because how to get a bilateral cross bite? When you have an enormous lower arch and you have the smallest possible upper arch, isn't it? Right? How often do you see that? It's very rare that you'll have a complete cross bite. Yeah? But very common, you'll get one side in a crossbite.
Right. Okay. I thought the upper jaw is the small and the lower jaw kind of just functional shift to one side.
Depends who you listen to.
Okay.
Some people will say it's
Yeah.
always that.
Yeah.
It's not always myself. It wasn't that. Anyway, but it depends who you listen to.
Okay.
And
But very rarely.
and how can you correct it?
Yeah.
If you listen to people who can correct it, but you won't listen to people who don't correct
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people can diagnose,
Yeah.
but how many people can resolve?